Okay, so I got a comment response on the first part of my video response, sorry, to Anita Sarkeesian's Ladies Tropes video. Part 1 of that response, I got a comment from somebody called Arales. And one of these comments where it's asking way too much of me. It's asking me questions, but it's way too much to expect me to answer that in a comment. I can barely answer it in however fucking long this video is going to be. And it's going to be a long one, by the way. But they're good questions, interesting questions, such as, do you see any gender inequality? If so, do you feel any responsibility to help end it, and how so? Do you feel feminism as a movement is helping? So I'm anticipating talking about a wide range of things involving feminism, feminist groups, MRA groups, perhaps real life circumstances in which they may or may not have made a difference. I'm maybe going to talk about the wage gap. The great thing is with all of this is that I've gone through this in my head several times, and the things that I bring up are different every time. So I'm thinking, let's just kind of make it organic. The last few videos I've made have been quite tightly scripted. Not scripted as in word for word, but the outline, the structure has been rigid. That's what I'm trying to say. The structure has been very rigid. And so I'm breaking free of those shackles, right, on this particular video. And I want to address these questions both in the video gamey context that it was made by Arales, but also in a more general context, because it just allows me to bring up some interesting subjects. So let's get going. But Arales said a couple of things first, which I thought were... I just got to tackle them briefly, right? So I'm reading what Arales had to say. So just so we're clear, you don't think that excluding women as playable characters while simultaneously providing sexualized images of women as a reward could be problematic? ? Wow. So we've juxtaposed playing as a male character and having sexualized images of women. Now, right, I'm trying to fathom, why would a games manufacturer put those two things together? Why would a games manufacturer put together being able to play as the kind of character that probably a man would most want to play with the kind of reward that a man would most want to have? You know, I'm kind of trying to work out what that could be. God, possibly just off the top of my head, because that particular game is aimed at a male audience. They're trying to capitalize on that large chunk of men out there that play video games and have the disposable cash to spend a bit of money on that video game. Just throwing that one out there, that perhaps it's not problematic, perhaps it's actually rather mundane. It's just the same as if you buy a women's magazine, it tends to include content that appeals to women. If you buy a men's magazine, it tends to include content, radical though it is, that appeals to men. And I suggest that the video games Arales is talking about have been made in the main to appeal to men. Now, if his problem is games are being made that appeal to men, well, then that is a separate argument. But the fact that these two things are juxtaposed together, I don't find problematic. I found them entirely mundane. You don't think there's a culture of male entitlement to women's bodies manifesting in sexual assault, catcalling, etc.? Perhaps. If you have a sense of entitlement to women's bodies, then you may catcall, then you may sexually assault as a result of it. But I don't think these things are necessary. These are just shitty things to do. And I think people will do shitty things whether they have a sense of entitlement or not. A sense of entitlement is not required to do shitty things. For me to put a sledgehammer through the side of your head doesn't require me to feel entitled to put a sledgehammer through the side of your head. For me to shout out, show us your tits, well, it could be because I feel entitled to do so, but it could just be because I'm a piece of crap, right? And that's why I do that kind of thing. Or it could be because I'm pissed out my head and I'm doing the kind of things that under normal circumstances I would realise are not the kind of things that I ought to be doing. The same as when I've gone into situations in my fire kit when I'm at work and there are drunk women, they say things like, get your kit off. Oh, why don't you show us your hose? It's not a sense of female entitlement at play there. It's just the fact that there's drunk, pissed up women who think that it's amusing to say those kinds of things, right? There's nothing sort of deeply mysterious in what is going on there. Nothing that requires a sense of entitlement. So that's got those bits out of the way, and we're only 4 minutes 40 seconds in, so that's going quite well. Right, so do you see any gender inequality? Let me answer that briefly from a video game perspective, and then we will move on to the bigger perspective that is really what I want to tackle, why I'm bothering making this video. From a video game perspective, yes, I see gender inequality. I see some inequalities that are perhaps market-driven, some inequalities that are perhaps market-driven, and they're more market-driven than they need to be, and that actually there is a bigger market for female gamers playing the kinds of games that we're talking about now, which isn't Candy Crush, it's first-person shooters, it's role-playing games, that isn't being tapped, and that perhaps they ought to be including more content for women. But then there's this other kind of inequality that works upon this naive sense that what is good for the goose is good for the gander, and that solutions that work for one sex, just dress it up for the other sex in exactly the same way and everybody will be happy. And you know, I go through this in more detail in part 3 of my response to Sarkeesian's video, but that never works out that way, right? If you provide two sets of rewards and they are asymmetric, they are different for each sex, people aren't happy. They want to see the same thing for each, right? If there's male nudity, we need to see female nudity. But if you have male and female nudity alongside each other, they're still not happy with it because that isn't really what they wanted in the first place. They wanted things that appeal to them. And it just seems that what appeals to men and women in terms of rewards in video games isn't necessarily just a mirror image of the same thing. But as I say, I go into that a little bit more depth in part 3 of my response to Sarkeesian in a much more rigid and structured way as well. Now, do I see any gender inequality out in the real world? Yes, I do. And the example that I want to talk about with this is a fascinating example, and it's an absolute shitfest of an example, and which is why it's something that I never normally talk about on YouTube, and that is the wage gap. Because nothing is more misinterpreted by people on every side, sometimes deliberately, sometimes in an absolutely bullshit way, but other times quite earnestly. And so I wanted to give a few thoughts on that and the way in which it can be misrepresented. In the States, it's often talked about a gap of women earn 77 or 78 cents for every dollar a man earns. And of course, the important thing to think is that that statistic on its own is really rather meaningless, and yet it's supposed to have some meaning for us. But it's a case of breaking those factors down, isn't it? And working out which one of those factors is something that we ought to feel motivated to do something about, and which is just facts of life, or the different choices that people make. Because people do make different choices, and there are differences between men and women, such as the fact that women have a womb, and they have babies, and they have tits, and so that is bound to impact, because it means a period away from work, a period falling behind by, if you have 3 babies, maybe 4 years you may have, say 5 years you may have out the workplace, if you take a lot of maternity time with all of that, and of course that's going to have an impact on everything. And it also means that there are reasons why women tend to go into part-time work, and the part-time work that follows on from having a baby is often not in the thing in which they're tooled up and skilled in. They may have spent 10 years learning to be skilled in something, and then they have children, and then they decide that they do. Same as my wife has reduced her hours, I haven't reduced my hours, because she feels that motivation, right? That is something that she wanted to do. She earns more than I do. She is the career-minded one, not me, but it is her that has altered her hours because it's something that she feels motivated to do, and I don't. Okay, so there are factors at play here. Like I say, part-time work often pays less because it's not the thing that you're actually skilled up in. Okay, do you know what would be really useful here? Do you know what I think would be really useful here would be a case study. So here's a case study, 2013 statistics, recent statistics for fucking Scotland. And this concerns do you know I can never do a Scottish accent without swearing. I don't know why that is. This concerns the gender pay gap in Scotland, and we're talking about a pay gap here, not an earnings gap here, so we're not looking at overtime or anything like that. We're looking at median hourly rates of pay and comparing men and women, and what we find for Scotland is that there is a 17% pay gap, a 17% pay gap, that women get 17% less as an hourly rate across the economy in Scotland than men do. Median figure. How does that break down? What would be interesting to know is how does that break down full-time and part-time? Well, here are the figures for Scotland. For full-time, men earn £13.27 on average, women earn £12.26. That is about an 8% gap, but we need a 17% gap, and I think most people's intuition would say, well, looking at those figures, we're going to expect a larger gap with part-time workers if it's only an 8% gap with full-time workers. And if that's what you think, well, if that's what you think, you're actually right, because there is a 10% gap for part-time workers. And here's the figure for part-time workers. And wow, I bet most of you didn't expect to see that. I'll be honest, when I first saw that, I didn't expect to see that. It's a 10% gap, but it's going in the wrong direction. This probably isn't a figure that you will see bandied about very often, but it's mirrored across the UK economy as a whole, not quantitatively but qualitatively, which is that men that work part-time get paid less per hour than women that work part-time. So that certainly doesn't account for the 17% gap. I'm sure most of you can guess what does account for the 17% gap. And it's this statistic here, and I'm afraid this graphic is for the UK as a whole, but the figures are very, very similar for Scotland. I've just got a graphic for the UK as a whole. I'll be honest with you, because I couldn't find a graphic for Scotland and this one was already made up. But it's the same figures. And the reason this is very, very important is it shows you just how important this business of part-time work is, and the fact that part-time work tends to be in roles that pay less than full-time work. And note how many discussions on the internet and beyond are discussing this figure and this figure, or discussing the wage gap in terms of this figure and this figure. At least that's what they think they're discussing, when what's really the key issue, as you can see in Scotland, and in fact for the United Kingdom as a whole, is this gap here. Okay, so ends the case study. Back on with the video. And we have to be careful not to conflate issues of earnings with rates of pay, and there's all these different things. But then you get somebody like Christina Hoff Sommers, who made a video, and she was talking in her video. Her video was pretty much a case of, well, if I can tell you what the factors are, then that explains it, and that's the end of it. And it just doesn't always work like that. And the problem is that someone like Christina Hoff Sommers is intelligent and well read enough on this to know. So she is misrepresenting, I'm quite certain on that, because she talked about, gave a number of the factors, and some of them I agreed with her about, and I thought, yeah, that is enough. Actually, with that factor, that is an explanation. But she talked about the fact that, well, the jobs that women tend to go into, and maybe I'll pause the video and show the clip when I get to editing. The jobs that women tend to go into tend to be the less well-paid jobs. And so that's it. That's explained it, really. It's not that men are getting paid better than women. It's that women are going into less well-paid jobs. So there you go. Take that. She says something like, if you take that into account, that women tend to go into less well-paid professions, the wage gap mysteriously disappears. As if that's the end of the conversation. It isn't. That's the kind of... And she's aware of this. She has to be aware of this. That isn't the end of the conversation. That's the start of the conversation. And the reason why it's the start of the conversation chimes in with a really interesting kind of dissonance that affects both sides here, right? That you get from both perspectives. And let's just say for a start that a reason that a lot of women going into these lower paid areas is because these are traditionally lower paid areas. Now, sometimes it is because they are less skilled areas, or there are other reasons why they are less deserving. The areas that make less revenue, and sometimes that is the key, right? Or the areas where it's easier to replace the person with somebody else. But sometimes it's nothing to do with any of those. It's just simply they are the female equivalent of the male equivalent job, and the male equivalent job has been paid more for historical reasons, because we all know that way back in dim and distant history it all started, that the jobs that women did were paid massively less than the jobs that men did. In fact, that was one of the problems with the Industrial Revolution. As machines were coming in there, allowing women to do work that was previously skilled men's work, and men were up in arms. They were the main breadwinners. And they could then be replaced with women, which you could pay a fraction of the amount that you would pay a man to do the work. And these things have hung over. So we have these areas now which are traditionally women's jobs, which are sometimes paid less as a result of a hangover from that, and then men's jobs which can be paid more. So the response is, the Christina Hoff Sommers response is, well, just go and work. Go to where you're paid more, right? Just go into a different field. It's that simple. And she's not the only one to make this. What I'll do is, I'll play you a clip, right? I'll play you a clip. But somebody said the other day, oh, you always seem to, it's always the feminist side you have a go at. It's always the fucking feminist side. So, okay, so what I'll do is I'll play you a clip of because I know he mentioned this really, Sargon of Akkad, right? I'll play you a clip of Sargon of Akkad, who I broadly agree with on most of the wage gap thing. I'll have to put it out there and say, let me play you a clip of Sargon of Akkad talking about this. And then I'll tell you what I find wrong with what he said, what I find dissonant about what he said, and why it's effective. It's one of these points that's going to earn me no fucking favours here, because it's a plague on both of their houses, really. So, Sargon of Akkad.
It's not that there are millions of women signing up to be nurses and carers, it's that society simply doesn't value those things highly enough. And because women choose to do these jobs in such large numbers, the wages for these jobs are not particularly high when compared to, say, I don't know, astrophysicists or something like that. And that is women's economic oppression. That seems to beg the question, why don't women escape economic oppression by becoming engineers?
Okay, so he'd just been dealing with Laurie Penny, actually, for about an hour there. So if his brain was a little bit addled, I should maybe cut him a little bit of slack on that one. But I fundamentally disagree with what he said at the end there, or at least the blithe, simplistic way in which he sort of said, well, if engineering pays better, women should just go into engineering. If only it were that simple. I don't think it's that simple. And the interesting bit, the dissonant bit is that the people who ought to think it that simple are not the people on Sargon of Akkad's side of this argument, it's the people on the other side of the argument. Because I'm assuming that Sargon of Akkad, as Christina's Hoff-Sommers, as myself, all feel the same here, which is that we do have some kind of innate predisposition, which in the old nature-nurture debate, it's not all blank slate, it's not all tabula rasa, right, that we do have predispositions. We are born with predispositions, and that those predispositions are subtly different, statistically speaking, on a population level between men and women. And not only that, we frame it in terms of nature-nurture, don't we? But perhaps, I've said this before, but I've got a little bit to add to this. Even in terms of the nurture side of it, that nature plays a part. I've talked before, I've proposed before, on a few occasions, that perhaps your genes, perhaps your evolutionary heritage not only chimes in the predispositions that you have as an individual, but also on the parent and the way that which you parent and the asymmetric way in which you bring up boys and girls. It is assumed, normally, that the fact that we bring up baby boys different to how we bring up baby girls is because we're cultured to do so. And there is obviously a cultural element in that way. I've been painting my baby boy's room blue, right? And I'm sure we all agree that is cultural. But the assumption is it's all cultural, and I've questioned that before, because if it's evolutionary advantageous under normal circumstances, not in the modern world, under normal circumstances for men to act a bit differently to women, then it's advantageous in an evolutionary sense to bring up boys in a slightly different way to girls. But that's all I've ever said, and just bear that in mind. Well, here's something a little bit more to add to that, a little bit more grist to that mill. It's a little bit of evidence here. It's a bit of scientific work into chimpanzees and chimp mothers, and guess what it shows? That in young chimps, and they stuck to very young chimps under 6 months, so you couldn't say, well, perhaps the chimp's behaviour is influencing the mother. Okay, chimps under 6 months old, chimp mothers bring up their baby boys different to how they bring up their baby girls. Wow, that is quite interesting, isn't it? Because we don't have the same grounds to assume that, well, it's just culture, it's just chimp culture that's persuaded the chimp mothers to bring up their baby boys different to their baby girls. We can see it's a much simpler society, chimps, isn't it? It's still quite complicated for animals other than ourselves, but it's a lot simpler than our own culture. And we can see what works as an adult male chimp and an adult female chimp, and we can work out what kind of behaviours would be useful to bring on, and it seems to chime in with that. It seems to be what you would expect evolution to err a chimp mother towards doing. Is it conclusive evidence? Is it bollocks? But I think it's quite useful. So we have that reason and many other bits before, which I've talked about in the past, to suspect that we have these predispositions. Predispositions, we're not talking about genetic determinism here, as I've said before. It's a little bit like your steering wheel pulling to one side. The fact you can steer the other way doesn't mean it isn't been pulling to one side all that time. And if you don't hold the wheel tight enough and don't actively oppose it, it will steer your car slightly to one side. That's what we're talking about, a predisposition. And no more. And expressed on a statistical level, when you look at a whole load of individuals, picking out one person who bucks the system means nothing. It means absolutely nothing whatsoever. But I think that Sargon of Akkad thinks like I do, thinks like Christina Hoff Sommers does, which is that we have these predispositions, that men's predispositions are slightly different to others, that men are generally drawn towards different jobs to women, and that we can try and do things within society to buck that system. And I'm sure there is some work to be done, because I trust that they think the same as I do, that what we want our young people to do is to feel they've got as many options open to them as possible, so that they can make the decisions that they want to make, that they can do the things that they want to be drawn to, and not feel pushed into certain lines and restricted because of their gender, their gender identity, their sexuality, their sexual identity, blah de blah de blah de blah de blah. That is the kind of thing that we want to get away from. But there will still be this residual, and this residual will be that there will be certain professions, such as caring professions, that probably women will always err towards, and other things such as engineering that perhaps I propose men will always err towards. So to hold those two views then, for me, is a bit of an issue. To hold the view that we have these predispositions, but say, well, don't worry if this profession pays less than this one, right? Women can just go to where the money is, because you know it's not as fucking simple as that. And then we have the people, the social justice mob on the other side, and what they say is no more reasonable, because they are the ones for whom this shouldn't be a problem, right? They're the ones who just see us all as a blank, more of a blank slate, right? It's just culture here. So it really shouldn't take very long, should it, to get women motivated to go just where the money goes, right? And yet they're the ones that have the object. They're the ones that say, oh, no, this is just, you can't expect that. That's not going to happen, right? So I see some dissonance on both sides here. It's almost as if one of them ought to say, hang on a minute, mate, I think you've got half my argument there. Can I have it back? Because the two arguments don't mate up. They need to be going like that, and they're going like this. That's the problem with it. If you believe that we have these predispositions, then unwarranted differentials in pay that result from historical things are a problem. And if you don't believe that we have these predispositions, then these historical problems aren't, at least they're not a gender issue, because people are fluid and they can much more easily change the types of profession that they are interested in. So I think that is an issue, right, in terms of the wage gap, which is that we need to start to specify, and I think it's good to start doing the kind of job analysis that has been mandated in the UK for some time, and certainly always took place for quite some time in the public sector, where you start to look at jobs and say, what is involved in this job? What skills are involved in this job? How easy is it somebody to replace people in this job? And to size that job up, and then to start comparing it to other similar jobs, and to see if the rate of pay is fair, because that way we can tackle these historical inaccuracies. And then it doesn't matter then, does it? It doesn't matter if women are drawn towards job X and men are drawn towards Y. Well, of course it matters, because for some people, unless there's exactly 50% of everybody doing every fucking job, they won't be happy, will they? And even if there are, they still won't be fucking happy. But for most of us, we'd be a whole lot happier, because then people could decide for themselves. That still doesn't mean, by the way, that a nurse will earn as much as an engineer, and it still doesn't mean that part-time work is going to earn as much as full-time work, but it is still an issue. And I think that somebody like Christina Hoff Sommers is totally out of order when she kind of portrays it as if, well, yeah, we've accounted for it all now, and if you want to earn more money, well, and just be interested in something different. If only it was that simple, Christina, and I think you're well aware of that. So yes, I do think there's gender inequality, and that is an example of a gender inequality that ought to be addressed. And I've edited at this point because I wanted to add a couple more bits with regard to this subject of inequality, of gender inequality, but tackling any kind of inequality, which is, and it sounds a kind of obvious thing to say, self-evidently true, and it's not telling anything about what I think, but there are right ways to do it and there are wrong ways to do it. And for me, the right ways to do it are things that are proactive, bringing people up, giving people alternatives. If people have educational problems, right, investing and doing what you can within their societies, within their cultures, within their groups, to give them, to better enable them to a better standard of education, or in the case of gender here, to better make people realise the scope of things that they have available to them. Absolutely, that's what we've done in the fire service, right? We've done a lot of work with regard to that, with regard to women, with promoting the fire service to women as something that they shouldn't rule out, that if they are motivated to do it, then why not give it a go, right? Because they will be welcome. And they are welcome, I can tell you, not just by the organisation, but by the people that work within the organisation and on watches. So a lot of work has been done like that. That is the kind of thing that I regard as reasonable ways of tackling inequality. What I regard as unreasonable is this kind of shit that happens in the States, it seems, all the time, which is this kind of fudging the issue, this kind of affirmative action, fudging the issue after the fact, which would be the equivalent of, in the case of the fire service, giving women easier tests to do to get in so that you can get more women in. Something that certainly doesn't happen in the UK fire service. It happens in the military, and perhaps that's something to consider, by the way, when we're having these discussions about women serving in combat roles. I know the military are law to themselves and probably just do what the fuck they like in any event, but at the moment you can see some justification for having a different standard in entrance tests between men and women in the military, because men have these extra infantry combat roles. But if everybody has those roles open to them, how can you then sustain, how can you then say, well, a man has got to run 1.5 miles a minute quicker than a woman? If she's capable of performing every role running it a minute slower, then he's capable of performing the role running it at exactly the same speed that she ran it out. So that's something to bear in mind there. But this incredible example that I saw, and I'll look the link out and I'll give you the link, it related to race, not to gender, and to what we would call East Asians in the UK, because Asians, when we talk about Asians, we mean Pakistanis, we mean Chinese people, we mean Bangladeshis, that's what we're referring to. So these East Asians in the States, some universities, because they've done so well, right, because they seem to be academically so gifted for one reason or another, they need to be penalised. It's just not right. It's like the yellow fucking peril, right? Too many of them are getting to university, so we've got to penalise them. I cannot see a legitimate reason for doing it. It's not as if they're all fabulously wealthy and that they've got to be penalised for being wealthy or anything like that. There's only seems to be two reasons, one of which is that they're more intelligent than the rest of us, which could potentially, there's no evolutionary reason why they're not, but we're not allowed to even think about that one. So just scratch the last 20 seconds, pretend I never even said it, just erase it from your brain. And the other reason is that they just work harder, right? They graft, right? And they have this culture, and they do seem to have this culture of hard work and the importance of academic success, and that you make sure you get your grades, you make sure you graft, you make sure you get to university and get a good job. Of course, there's a downside to anything like that. Part of the downside is if you fail under that system, there's a lot of pressure on you, and it's got to be really, really difficult to fail under that system. The other downside is that it makes it a little bit harder for everybody else. But so fucking what? Why should somebody's hard work be penalised because they've worked hard? And it then makes it a kind of double whammy. What they've done is they've said, right, for working so hard, we're going to raise the score that you have to get. If you're a member of this ethnic group, if you're a member of this race, you've got to get an even higher score. You already had to get a higher score than some other ethnic groups. Well, now even old whitey, right, you've got to even get a higher score than the sort of white people that make up the majority in the country. You've even got to get a higher score than them now because you're just doing too well. It's a massive double whammy. This is the problem. Is that acts of discrimination can be carried out by individuals, groups, systematic discrimination, institutionalized discrimination, but they are always experienced each and every fucking time by individuals, every fucking time. And this is why one act of discrimination doesn't count out another act of discrimination, because in this case, what about if you're from an East Asian family that doesn't have that mentality, that hasn't pushed you? Well, not only do you suffer from having a family that didn't have that mentality and didn't push you, but just to add insult to fucking injury, you've now got to get a higher score than everybody else. So how is that fair? Or in the case of other jobs where you look at a disproportionate number of women, small number of women are in the job, and it's like, well, yeah, what we'll do is then we'll put some discriminatory practice in to get loads more women in, right? But everybody applies for a job as an individual, don't they? You don't apply as a group. Right, and if somebody from that same group gets the job, well, it doesn't matter, I didn't get the job, but another man got the job and he will give me some of his wages when he gets him. I'm absolutely positive. So just the fact that like 10 years ago or 20 years ago, women were discriminated getting in that job, just then discriminating against another person is just another act of discrimination. And that is something that just seems such a negative way. It's like the two wrongs must make a right somewhere down the line, but they don't, do they? Two wrongs make two wrongs, and effectively trying to solve an act of discrimination with another act of discrimination is really something that you should use with extreme caution. So yes, tackle inequality, but fucking hell, I think it's a very, very careful little line we've got to tread there. Next question, because I've gone on about that one for long enough. If so, do you feel any responsibility to help end it, and how so? I don't feel as if there's any external compunction for me to end any particular type of inequality, right? Any more than the other myriad, millions, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of issues that affect people around the world. People are dying of cancer. Do I feel responsibility to solve that? No. Do I feel as responsibility should be placed on me for anything other than my own behaviour and those people that I have some immediate influence over, such as my family that I can influence to some extent, my little lad that I'm bringing up? Other than those, no, I don't. But I do have a certain sort of feeling within myself, right, that some of these things that I feel motivated to speak out about and to do something about, because I don't like to see them. If I see something and I think, do you know what, I can pinpoint there is something going on there that is manifestly unfair, then I'm not happy to just sit on the sidelines. I don't think it's my responsibility, but it's something that I'm happy to take on board in the limited capacity that I have to take those things on board. Given that I'm not an activist type, I'm not going to go out waving a placard or doing anything like that. That's not the kind of person that I am. But I might talk about it on a video such as this and try desperately hard not to misrepresent those things and to be as honest as I can. And as forthright as I can when I deal with those issues. That's about all I want to say on that one. Interesting last one. Do you feel feminism as a movement is helping? And you know, it's so easy to just take a negative slant on feminism, because it's like anything, the squeaky wheel gets the grease, and of course it's the fucking wankers like Amanda Marcotte and Jessica Valenti that wind us up, right? That obviously the reason that they get articles in papers and in various media is because they are provocative, because they have a provocative message that you're going to click on, that you're going to want to read and maybe get a bit wound up about. So that is why they have the voice that they have. But unfortunately, I think they do a poor job of representing feminism. Do I think feminism is helping? I don't think it always helps itself. But I do think that it is helping. I think that issues get brought up that wouldn't have got brought up without feminism. I talked about the fire brigade, didn't I, earlier on? You know, let me talk about the fire brigade again. Some of the things that have happened in the fire brigade in terms of trying to get more women involved in the fire service in the UK wouldn't have happened, I don't think, if it wasn't for feminism, because there wouldn't have been issues that are in the public eye. There wouldn't have been that motive force causing that to happen in the first place. And a classic example of why that is, and first let's dispel the myth that feminists are about men's issues as well, because they're fucking not. Feminists are about men's issues right? When, as a result of solving a woman's issue, a man's issue gets dealt with as well. Then it's like, oh, well, yes, men's issues are going to get solved along the way. They are, but as some kind of waste product that's shat out the back, they're going to get solved. But that's fine. I wouldn't expect more than that. It's feminism. It's about women. So I had no problem with that. That isn't a weakness of feminism, but let's just be honest about it, right? If you look at the situation in nursing, which is almost a mirror image of the fire service, which is that men are underrepresented. About 90% of nurses in the UK are women, right? Men are grossly underrepresented in that. You have a look on the site of the Royal College of Nursing. You do a Google for the Royal College of Nursing, who's in charge of nursing in the UK, and see what they have done to try and promote nursing amongst men, to try and get more men interested in nursing, to try and make nursing more man-friendly and make men realise that they'd be welcome in the nursing profession and it's something that they should consider. I'll tell you what you will find: fuck all, because precisely fuck all has been done this year, last year, or in the preceding few fucking decades. Fuck all has been done. In fact, whereas in firefighting we've changed the word from fireman to firefighter, just the same as we've gone from chairman to chairperson, etc., the NHS still uses the terms matron and sister. Right, now, why is that? The reason is because there is no equivalent of feminism dealing with men's issues. And the reason I say that is to show you what difference feminism can make. So even if you don't agree with the issues, the point is it puts the issues in the public eye, and the issues are in the public eye, then they're going to get addressed. Then they are going to be dealt with. So yes, in terms of dealing with issues, of course it has an effect. And the same goes with MRAs, of course, right? Now, it may be that the incarnations of MRAs that people talk about tend to be way too focused on the negativity towards feminism than on solving things. But let me give you an example of an MRA group that made a difference in the UK. I think made a difference. A few years ago, a group called Fathers for Justice, who were an MRA group in anything other than name, and I think the only reason anything other than they didn't refer to themselves as an MRA group is because it's a kind of term that just seems to have cropped up. I'd never heard of the term up until a year and a half, 2 years ago. They did some work regarding fathers and the status of fathers with regard to their children and the status of fatherhood and some of the terrible treatment that fathers often get, especially when the divorce courts and the family courts get together, and we end up with these situations where, especially if young children are involved, the presumption, the state-sponsored presumption, is that children are better off with a mother, and that's not as a result of analysing the two people and arriving at a conclusion. That is the starting point, and then unless there's something significant to contradict that is the assumption, and as a result of that, then the divorce court comes in. This person has the children, so they will need the house and all the resources. That person ends up living in a bedsit because that's all the money they've got, and as a result of living in the bedsit, then the family court comes along and says, well, no, you can't have your children staying over because you're just living in a bedsit. You need to get yourself living somewhere better if you want to have your children over. And then the child support agency says, can I have another big handful of money, please, to pay for your children? So it's a horrible, horrible, fucked up situation. And they did a lot of work bringing that situation into the public eye. Before they brought it into the public eye, although many people, and I was one of them, was aware of it, it was never discussed. So they did good work there. Right? And even if you didn't agree with the way they went about it and some of the things they did, because they suffered from the same problem that feminism suffers from, which is, of course, they attracted fucking idiots. They attracted fathers with genuine complaints, but they also attracted fathers who were total wankers, who there's no right, but they had no fucking right to see their kids because they were total fucking idiots, right? They attracted them. And of course they would attract some people that hate women, that don't like women, that just have an issue with women and saw that movement as a chance to get back to women. And those people harmed Fathers for Justice. And the same thing happens with feminism. Of course it does. If you're a woman and you really don't like men, then you're going to be drawn to feminism, aren't you? right? If you have issues with men, you're going to be drawn to feminism. But of course, that isn't an issue that is inherently wrong with feminism. It's just the fucking nature of politics, which is people who aren't nice people inevitably get drawn to the viewpoint that is closer to their own, or they think that they can profit from being associated with. And what do they end up doing? They end up dragging that viewpoint down. Do I feel feminism as a movement is helping? Yes, I think it brings a lot of arguments, a lot of even the wage gap one, and although it might be misrepresented, and the point of looking at 78 cents in the dollar, it's a stupid and meaningless fucking statistic to start from. It's a total waste of time. It's a really ridiculous starting point to have, but it does get the conversation out there, and I do think it is a conversation that needs to be had, and I propose to you that conversations like that would not be taking place if it wasn't for feminism. And the very fact MRAs make this, that men's issues are not treated the same way and that men's issues go under the radar, is because men's issues do not have the equivalent of feminism. Well, I think that answers the questions there. Thank you for watching, and bye for now.